under the blazing lights of a crowded studio, the cameras were already rolling before anyone truly realized that history was about to be made. It was one of those television broadcasts that promised to be routine. Another segment, with a foreign guest who claimed she had come to Africa with goodwill, promises of aid, and the language of partnership. She walked onto the stage with confidence, her smile practiced, her tone measured. She introduced herself as a humanitarian, someone who wanted to help Africa overcome its challenges. The audience clapped politely, but sitting across from her, Ibrahim Traoré, the young and unflinching leader of Burkina Faso, studied her with the gaze of a soldier who had seen too much to believe in appearances. He had not risen to leadership by being Na'vi, and he had no intention of letting a disguised agenda slip past him, especially not on live television. From the very beginning, her language carried undertones that unsettled him. She spoke of Africa as though it were helpless, as though, without the guidance of outsiders, it could never stand on its own 2 feet. She praised international organizations and Western governments for their generosity, while subtly implying that African nations lacked the discipline and the intelligence to solve their own problems. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but she carried on, unaware that each sentence she delivered was sharpening the blade of her own undoing. Traore allowed her to speak, nodding occasionally, his expression unreadable. To him, silence was a weapon and patience was a strategy. When she finished her opening remarks, Traore leaned forward, his voice calm but piercing. He began with simple questions. Who had sent her? Which organization funded her work? Why did so much of her aid come with conditions attached? She answered quickly, but her rehearsed lines wavered under the weight of his precision. He pressed further, asking about projects that had mysteriously collapsed, about funds that had vanished, about her frequent private meetings with diplomats known not for charity, but for intelligence gathering. The room grew tense. Viewers across the nation leaned closer to their screens, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. The woman tried to laugh off his questions, framing herself as misunderstood, a victim of suspicion. But Traore did not smile. His eyes narrowed slightly, his tone steady, almost surgical. He began to lay out evidence, not rumors, not vague accusations, but facts. Dates of her travel that coincided perfectly with military operations by foreign forces, reports of her meetings with so-called contractors who were in fact linked to espionage networks, documents that had been intercepted, proving her communications with officials who had no interest in helping Africa, but every interest in controlling it. With each revelation, the air in the studio grew heavier. The audience's polite curiosity turned into shock. The cameras zoomed in on her face, and for the first time her composure cracked. She stammered, searching for words, her once confident voice faltering. Traore did not raise his tone. He did not need to. He explained that Africa had endured decades of such manipulation, men and women who arrived with smiles and promises, only to take resources, sow division, and leave behind chaos. He reminded the audience that sovereignty is not for sale, that true help comes without strings attached, and that Africa is not a playground for foreign agendas. His words rang not only for those in the studio but for millions watching live across Africa, Europe, and even America. And then came the moment no one expected. Traore produced a document, handed to him by his security team, and held it up for the cameras. It was proof that this so-called humanitarian was, in fact, on the payroll of a foreign intelligence service. The paper bore official markings, signatures, undeniable evidence. Gasps filled the room. The woman froze, her face draining of color. The truth had been laid bare for all to see. Not in private whispers, but under the full glare of the public eye. The host of the program, who had started the show expecting a polite conversation, could hardly find words. The studio audience erupted, some in outrage, others in awe of Traore's composure and courage. The woman, once so certain of her performance, sat trembling, her mask shattered. Traore's voice cut through the noise, calm but thunderous in its clarity. He said that Africa had nothing against cooperation, nothing against partnership, but what it would never again accept was deception dressed as aid. He spoke of dignity, of independence, of the right of African nations to walk their own path without being watched, manipulated, or spied upon. For the American audience watching clips of this confrontation later, it was a scene that resonated deeply. It was a reminder of their own history. When foreign powers once underestimated their resolve, when America itself had to stand up and declare that it would no longer be treated as a pawn in someone else's game. The parallel was unmistakable. Just as early American leaders exposed the schemes of empires that sought to keep them dependent, here was an African leader doing the same for his people, live on television with the whole world watching. The fallout was immediate. Headlines exploded across global media. Some outlets tried to downplay the story, calling it a misunderstanding. Others could not deny the evidence and acknowledged it as one of the most daring exposures in recent diplomatic history. In the streets of Burkina Faso and beyond, people celebrated. They felt seen, defended, vindicated. For too long, they had suspected that behind the curtain of charity lurked something darker, and now their leader had shown the courage to prove it openly. The woman was quietly escorted out of the studio, her career shattered, her mission exposed. But the greater impact was not on her life, but on the collective awakening of those who had watched. Traore had not simply unmasked one individual. He had exposed a system, a pattern, a reality that had been ignored for too long. And in doing so, he had strengthened the trust between himself and his people, proving that he would not bend to manipulation, that he would guard their sovereignty at all costs. The story did not end that night. Across Africa, leaders began to reconsider the presence of certain NGOs and so-called charities operating within their borders. Investigations were launched, partnerships were re-examined, and for the first time in a long time, people felt empowered to question the motives of those who claimed to help. In America, commentators debated the incident with fascination. Some praised Traore for his sharpness, his refusal to be fooled, threatened. Others admitted that it was a wake-up call about how foreign interests often disguise themselves under noble language. The power of the broadcast was not just in the exposure, but in the lesson it carried. Respect cannot be faked. True partnership cannot be built on lies. And no matter how carefully deception is crafted, there will always be a moment when truth slices through the performance. For the young viewers in Burkina Faso watching their president stand firm, it was a lesson in pride, in vigilance, and in leadership. For Americans watching from afar, it was a story that echoed their own values, standing against arrogance, exposing lies, and defending liberty. The woman who once walked onto that stage believing she would charm the audience, instead left as a symbol of failure. Her mask torn apart by the steady resolve of a leader who refused to be patronized. Traore did not gloat. He did not need to humiliate her further. His dignity in that moment was greater than her deception, and that contrast told the world everything it needed to know. The truth had been revealed, and nothing could hide it again. The broadcast ended, but the echoes continued long after. Across homes, cafes, and offices, people replayed the clip, sharing it on phones and social media, marveling at the courage it took to do what he had done live, with no chance of editing or denial. The message spread like wildfire, not just across Africa, but across continents. This was not merely about one spy, it was about reclaiming respect, about drawing a line in the sand that could no longer be crossed. For America, a country built on exposing tyranny and declaring independence in the face of overwhelming odds, this story felt almost familiar. It was as if a young African leader had reached across history and mirrored the same courage that had once defined America itself. It reminded viewers that the fight for dignity is universal, that freedom is fragile, and that every generation must have leaders willing to confront deception with truth. And so, what began as a staged interview turned into a global revelation. A woman who said she came to help was revealed as a spy. A leader who many underestimated proved his strength once again. And a continent, often dismissed as powerless, showed that it had defenders who would not be silenced. Ibrahim Traoré's calm exposure on live television was more than just a political moment. It was history, raw and undeniable, unfolding before our eyes. The shockwaves from that live television broadcast did not stop at the studio walls. Overnight, the story of Ibrahim Traoré exposing the so-called humanitarian swept across the globe. Social media in Africa erupted with praise, citizens posting clips with captions like, "Our leader sees through the lies," and "Africa will never bow again." But the reverberations were not limited to Africa. In Washington, London, and Paris, policymakers scrambled to respond. Some dismissed the moment as political theater, but behind closed doors, intelligence briefings acknowledged that Traore had outmaneuvered a foreign operative live on air, and that the humiliation was complete. For the people of Burkina Faso, this was more than just another headline. It was validation of years of suspicion that foreign actors had been operating under the guise of charity. Families who had lived through projects that began with fanfare only to collapse with no results began sharing their own stories. Farmers recalled aid workers who seemed more interested in maps than in crops. Teachers remembered visiting consultants who asked more questions about the community leaders than about the students. And now, finally, the truth had been spoken aloud by their president in a way that could no longer be denied. In America, the reaction was complex but deeply engaged. On conservative talk shows, commentators compared Traoré's actions to the spirit of the founding fathers, who themselves once had to expose spies and agents of foreign empires pretending to offer support. On social media, Americans shared the clip with captions like, "This guy gets it," and "reminds me of George Washington facing down the British." For a pro-American audience, the symbolism was powerful: a leader standing calmly against deception, unmasking a spy without fear, and doing so in the full light of day. It echoed a fundamental American belief that the truth, once revealed, cannot be suppressed. Meanwhile, in European capitals, the incident raised uncomfortable questions. Why had a supposed humanitarian been operating with such suspicious ties? Was this an isolated case or part of a broader strategy? Newspapers in France ran divided coverage. Some framed Traore as paranoid, while others admitted that his evidence was solid and that the woman's exposure was undeniable. In the coffee shops of Paris and Brussels, ordinary citizens debated whether their governments had crossed the line by sending operatives disguised as aid workers. The embarrassment was palpable, and once again, it was Traore who had dictated the terms of the conversation. The studio footage itself became iconic. The image of Traore holding up the document, steady and unwavering, circulated like wildfire. Memes appeared, with captions like "checkmate" and "aid or espionage," even in America, where the details of African politics often go unnoticed. The clip found an audience. Many saw in Traore's composure the same type of clarity they admired in their own heroes, men and women who refused to bow to arrogance, who refused to let smooth-talking deceivers rewrite the truth. It was not about Burkina Faso alone anymore. It was about the universal struggle between honesty and deceit. The woman who had once introduced herself with charm now became a cautionary tale. Her employers tried to distance themselves, claiming she had acted independently. But the evidence Traore revealed told a different story, one that implicated powerful institutions. She was quietly recalled, her name scrubbed from official rosters, but in the public's memory she would forever be known as the spy who was caught live on television. Her downfall was swift, but her exposure had already sparked something much larger than her career. Inside Burkina Faso, people felt a surge of pride. Children in schools spoke about the moment as if it were a scene from a movie. Teachers used it as an example of integrity, a reminder that even in the face of pressure, one could hold firm to truth. Elders in villages discussed it by firelight, recalling how for generations foreign powers had come with smiles only to take advantage of them. Now, they said, the tide was turning. Their president had shown that they would no longer be fooled. For Traore himself, the decision to confront her so directly was not taken lightly. He knew the risks. Exposing a spy live on television was not just a national statement. It was a direct challenge to the networks of power that had long considered Africa easy to manipulate. He understood that there would be backlash, that foreign governments would quietly plot ways to retaliate. But he also knew that his people needed to see strength, not just behind closed doors but in the open, where no one could question what had happened. That night, as the cameras went off and the studio emptied, he walked away knowing he had lit a fire that could not be extinguished. In America, younger viewers who discovered the clip on TikTok and YouTube were especially fascinated. The idea of a president unmasking a spy in real time felt almost cinematic, like a scene from a thriller. But what struck them most was Traore's demeanor. He did not shout, he did not rage, he simply presented the truth with calm authority. That restraint, that discipline, reminded many Americans of the leaders they admired. Those who showed strength not through bluster but through clarity and conviction. The African diaspora in the United States also reacted strongly. African Americans, Jamaicans, Haitians, and others who traced their roots to the continent felt a deep sense of pride. For years, they had grown accustomed to negative portrayals of African leaders. But here was a man who stood tall, unafraid, and uncompromising in the defense of his people. Churches in cities like Atlanta and New York discussed the story in sermons, framing it as a lesson in discernment, how even in modern times, wolves still come in sheep's clothing, and how leaders must have the courage to expose them. What made the story resonate so deeply was its universality. Everyone, whether in Africa or America, had experienced moments of betrayal, moments when someone who claimed to help was in fact working against them. Traore's exposure of the spy was not just a political act, it was a metaphor for vigilance in daily life. It reminded parents to protect their families, reminded workers to question false promises, reminded citizens to remain alert to those who would exploit them. The woman herself faded into obscurity, but the image of Traore confronting her only grew in strength. In documentaries, commentators described it as a turning point, a symbol of Africa's growing refusal to accept foreign manipulation. In the classrooms of the United States, professors of political science used it as a case study in modern statecraft, showing how one leader with conviction could change the narrative of an entire continent. And in small towns across America, ordinary people shared the story as an example of integrity, proof that truth still mattered in a world of deception. What began as an interview had transformed into an unforgettable confrontation, one that no amount of spin could erase. For those who supported Traore, the moment was nothing less than historic. For those who opposed him, it was a nightmare. And, for the rest of the world, it was a reminder that deception, no matter how carefully hidden, will always face the light of truth. As the story continued to unfold, the backlash grew sharper and more complicated. Internationally, the exposure of a spy on live television could not be dismissed as a misunderstanding. Governments that had long operated with a sense of impunity in Africa suddenly found themselves under scrutiny. Analysts on global networks debated what the incident meant. Some framed it as a bold stand by an African leader tired of old patterns. Others warned that it could escalate tensions between Burkina Faso and powerful nations who had grown accustomed to using covert influence. But the undeniable fact was this: Ibrahim Traoré had shifted the balance, not through military force or secret negotiations, but with the undeniable power of truth revealed in public. In Paris, the humiliation was acute. French officials, already uneasy about the decline of their influence in the Sahel, were forced to watch as Traoré dismantled their methods before the entire world. The exposure of the woman, who had connections to French intelligence networks, was not just a local embarrassment, but a geopolitical blow. Newspapers carried op-eds demanding answers. Protesters in African communities across Europe used the incident to call out decades of exploitation, chanting that their leaders back home had finally found the courage to fight back. In Washington, the reaction was different. American leaders, though not directly implicated in the incident, recognized the symbolism immediately. Traoré had exposed a spy without blinking, and his calm firmness reminded many Americans of their own struggle against foreign manipulation centuries earlier. Conservative commentators praised the moment as a triumph of sovereignty, comparing it to early American defiance against British agents who pretended to act as allies but worked to keep the colonies dependent. Even progressive voices in the US acknowledged that what had unfolded was an undeniable act of integrity. The American public, particularly pro-freedom and pro-sovereignty audiences, embraced Traore's stance as a reflection of values they cherish: honesty, independence, and courage in the face of deceit. Clips of the broadcast spread on American platforms like wildfire. Some captions read, "This is what leadership looks like." Others simply said, "Respect." Traore's name, unfamiliar to many Americans before, suddenly became a symbol of resistance and dignity. For Traore, the risk of global isolation loomed. But the reward was far greater. His people now saw him as unshakable, a man who would not be deceived, a leader who would protect them not just with soldiers, but with the force of truth. Crowds filled the streets of Ouagadougou, waving flags, chanting his name, praising him not just for exposing the spy, but for sending a message that Burkina Faso's sovereignty could no longer be toyed with. The global fallout also forced a revaluation of aid programs across Africa. Nations began auditing the activities of NGOs, scrutinizing contracts, and demanding transparency. For too long, aid had been a cover for interference. Now, empowered by Traore's example, African governments dared to ask difficult questions. The ripple effect was undeniable. Even in countries where leaders had been hesitant to confront foreign powers, citizens began demanding accountability. They pointed to the broadcast as proof that lies could be unmasked, that manipulation could be resisted. Back in America, the story inspired conversations far beyond geopolitics. Families at dinner tables discussed how one man's calm exposure of deception reminded them of everyday struggles against dishonesty. Whether in politics, business, or personal life, churches framed it as a spiritual lesson, a moment when light triumphed over darkness, when truth pierced through disguise. In schools, students debated whether modern leaders in the West would have the same courage to confront lies as Traore had shown in that studio. Meanwhile, the woman at the center of the scandal faded into obscurity, her name erased from official mentions, but never forgotten by the public. She became a cautionary tale, a living reminder that deception, no matter how polished, is doomed when faced with evidence and conviction. For those who had trained her, the loss was humiliating. For those who watched, it was justice. The strength of the moment was not in its drama alone, but in the fact that it was undeniable. There was no way to spin away the document Traore held up, no way to explain away the stammering of the exposed spy. Unlike so many diplomatic scandals hidden in shadows, this one had unfolded in front of millions of eyes. And because it happened live, it could never be undone. That permanence gave the story its historic weight. In America, where mistrust of institutions has grown over time, Traore's act became a kind of mirror. People asked themselves who among our leaders would dare to expose deception so boldly? Who would hold up the truth live, with the whole world watching? The admiration was not just for him as an African leader, but for the universal principle he embodied: integrity without compromise. The more the footage circulated, the more symbolic it became. It was not just about Burkina Faso anymore. It was about the global South standing up, about small nations refusing to be manipulated, about the dignity of people who had been underestimated for too long. And for American audiences, it was about remembering that freedom is never given freely. It is defended, protected, and at times exposed in moments of courage. The weeks that followed brought more scrutiny, more debates, but also more respect. African youth, inspired by Traore's composure, began speaking openly about taking pride in their nations, about rejecting the idea that only outsiders could solve their problems. American commentators encouraged their audiences to see the parallels, reminding them that America itself was born when ordinary people stood up to empires that underestimated them. The global order did not change overnight, but something undeniable had shifted. One television broadcast had become a symbol of a deeper awakening, a crack in the old system of exploitation, and in the heart of it stood Ibrahim Traoré, not shouting, not boasting, but calmly, fearlessly, exposing a spy with nothing more than truth and conviction. In the months that followed the shocking live broadcast, the story refused to die down. Instead, it grew into something larger than a single incident, larger than one leader or one spy. It became a parable about dignity, deception, and the unshakable power of truth. Every time the footage was replayed, people across the world felt the same chill. An arrogant mask being ripped away in front of millions threatened the silence of the moment, broken only by the trembling denials of someone who had been caught in the act. It was raw, undeniable, and unforgettable. For Ibrahim Traoré, the incident cemented his reputation far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. He was no longer just a young leader who had risen to power during turbulent times. He was now the man who had stared deception in the eye and called it what it was without flinching. That reputation carried weight. When he spoke at international gatherings, the same diplomats who once dismissed him as inexperienced listened closely. They knew he would not be intimidated, nor would he play along with the old games of manipulation. African citizens across the continent treated the moment like a turning point. Markets buzzed with conversations about the broadcast. Barbershops replayed clips on small televisions, schools debated it in classrooms. For many, it was the first time they had seen one of their leaders expose a foreign agent in such a direct, unapologetic way. It felt like centuries of silent humiliation had been broken in an instant, and the pride that welled up from that moment could not be contained. But the ripple effects reached far beyond Africa. In America, the story resonated with ordinary people who were tired of dishonesty in public life. It spoke to the part of the American spirit that values straight talk, accountability, and the courage to confront wrongdoing, even when it is risky. Commentators drew parallels to moments in American history when leaders had refused to be deceived, when truth was revealed at great personal cost, but became the foundation of trust and freedom. Traoré's act, though taking place thousands of miles away, felt like a reflection of those same values. Churches across the U.S. picked up the story as an example of moral courage. Pastors used it in sermons, reminding their congregations that darkness cannot hide forever when the light of truth is brought forward. Civic groups and classrooms discussed the event as proof that integrity still matters, that leadership is not about smiling for cameras, but about making choices that stand the test of time. Families watching the footage with their children explained the lesson in simple terms: lies eventually collapse, but truth endures. In the geopolitical arena, the exposure forced even the most powerful nations to reconsider their tactics. Countries that had operated quietly through networks of covert operatives found themselves more cautious. They realized that in the age of instant communication, one live broadcast could destroy years of manipulation. The fear of exposure, amplified by Traoré's precedent, changed the way foreign policy was conducted in Africa. Meanwhile, Burkina Faso experienced a surge of confidence. The nation that many had dismissed as small and insignificant now held a story that inspired the world. Foreign delegations arriving in Ouagadougou tread more carefully, and knowing that the young leader they were meeting had a global reputation for boldness and an unbreakable commitment to sovereignty. The same hotels, restaurants, and streets that once saw visitors carry themselves with superiority now hosted more cautious conversations. Everyone knew the country had changed. Everyone knew its leader had set a tone that demanded respect. And for Traoré, the moment became a foundation. Threatened, he reminded his people constantly that exposing the spy was not about embarrassing one person or one nation, but about protecting their dignity as a people. He stressed that Burkina Faso would continue to welcome genuine friends, but it would never again allow deception to hide under the cloak of charity or partnership. His words were simple but powerful: respect us or leave us. That clarity resonated not only in his country, but across Africa and even in the United States. American audiences found themselves respecting Traoré more with each passing week. They saw in him a leader who was not afraid to say no, not afraid to hold the line. For a country that has long admired strength and honesty, the moment felt refreshing. Even though the cultures were different, the values aligned. Americans understood immediately that what he had done took courage, the same courage they wished to see more of in their own politics. The spy scandal might have faded like so many news cycles, But because it happened on live television, it remained a permanent reminder. It became a clip that students watched, that commentators replayed, that truth tellers everywhere used as an example. It was history written not in treaties or wars, but in a few minutes of undeniable honesty. And those moments often carry more power than entire battles. Months turned into a year, and yet the story kept returning. Every anniversary of the broadcast, the footage was replayed. Every time another scandal involving deception appeared in world news, people compared it to the moment Traore exposed the spy. The story had become larger than life, a symbol of the age-old struggle between manipulation and integrity. In America, the admiration only grew. While many foreign leaders are often viewed with skepticism, Traore became an unlikely figure of respect among everyday Americans. When you did not need to agree with all his politics to recognize the courage in what he did. To them, it was about something universal, a man standing up against deceit and doing it without fear. In a divided political climate, that kind of clarity was rare, and it struck a chord that crossed party lines. The woman herself was forgotten by most, but her role as a cautionary tale endured. Her story was told not as one of personal failure alone, but as an example of what happens when arrogance collides with truth. For those who had sent her, she was a reminder that no matter how clever the disguise, the truth has a way of breaking through. And in Burkina Faso, children grew up with the story as part of their national pride. Parents told them, "Remember the day our president exposed the lie." Teachers used it as a lesson about vigilance, about refusing to accept things at face value. The next generation grew up knowing that dignity was not negotiable. The lesson was simple but timeless: lies can travel far, but they will not last forever. Deception may wear a mask, but sooner or later, someone will pull it off. And when that happens, the world changes, even if just for a moment. For Ibrahim Traoré, that moment defined him. For his people, it defined their era. And for America and the wider world, it served as a reminder that the courage to tell the truth, no matter how risky, is the most powerful weapon any leader can hold.